Okay, so the first thing I wanted to touch on this week was the John Rawls reading, The Case for Equality. And I actually had some really interesting takeaways from this, just overall, some of my thoughts. I thought he actually made a really great argument for the fair and just social contract. And this was kind of his approach for how we have equality and what true, fair, just equality through the social contract looks like in our society. And essentially, he proposed that we, just by naturally being born in this, in the United States or in this country or in any other country, that naturally we've just adopted those values and kind of fell under those laws, those standards, and those American ways of life simply just by existing. And he really made a strong case for, we didn't really help create them. So, how is that fair that we just, you know, adopt and we're just okay because this is just the way that it is without really having much of a say in what we feel is just and fair in our culture. And I wanted to touch on the Constitution a little bit because this is something that my husband and I have talked a lot about, and how it's funny that we brought this up a while ago. We feel the Constitution should be looked over and ratified every certain amount of years. So it was interesting that he made this case. He essentially said that we should ratify the Constitution every 19 years. So every 2 decades, to be safe. And ideally, the point of that would be to stay relevant and to keep your laws and your values and your society norms up to date so that you don't have things that were, fair and just, by the lawmakers means 75 to 100 years ago. And then, fast forward to 2020, we're living in a completely different culture that's actually discriminatory against other people, and those things need to be ratified and changed. So I thought that argument was actually really interesting, and it is something I've thought a lot about. And he also said that we need fair and equal knowledge when it comes to the lawmaking and the Constitution, and that here in the US, our Constitution actually unfairly benefits certain groups, and particularly, sorry, more powerful groups, people that are already in power, which in our society tends to be more wealthy Caucasian people, men in particular. So, the idea of the social contract is that we deserve peace and non interference, right? That's the whole purpose of the social contract to begin with. And we agree to abide by that. But we also like to live in societies that benefit us the most. And that's where a little bit of that selfish, egalitarian, compared to Republicans, they're ideally, really not that much different. They tend to fall a little bit more in the middle part of the spectrum. So there is a little bit of that selfish motivation behind it. However, Rawls said that we can actually be fairly selfish in terms of our position in society, and that there is a way to do this through the original position, our position within society. And the thing that stuck out the most to me was that idea of this veil of ignorance. And this is how I try to make my decisions and how I try to live my life. So I really appreciated this. It's the idea that you're kind of putting on those blinders. You're kind of creating this, like, okay, so let's pretend that I'm not Julia. I'm not white. I'm not female. I'm not upper middle class, or, whatever class I am. None of those things exist. All those extenuating factors that make me or that give me purpose in society and tell me who I am in our society. Let's pretend that all of those things are gone, right? So that veil of ignorance. If I wasn't rich, if I wasn't white, if I wasn't all of these things, what kind of society would I want to live in? Would I want to live in a society where certain people were discriminated against, where certain people couldn't learn things in their language? So, hypothetically, like, if I am who I am, right, and I'm middle class or upper middle class, and I'm white and I'm pro this and pro that, technically that is discriminating, whether I'm trying to or not. That's not the point. I'm essentially interfering on someone else's right to live a free, fair, just, great quality of life. And essentially, he argues that we want meaningful access to a good life. We want true equality. We want non interference. So, what kind of society would I want to live in? And no matter who I turn out to be in that society, I want to have access to that meaningful, good life. And so, me personally, I do try to not put myself in other people's shoes, because the whole idea of that veil of ignorance is that we're not in anybody's shoes. We're just a complete blank slate. But I really think that if our society took a little bit more of that approach, and really considered what kind of society would I want to live in if I didn't have my social identity, I actually think a lot of us would maybe do things a little bit differently. We would think about things differently. We'd be more sensitive to things that we should be more sensitive of, and we'd be more aware of things that we should be more aware of. So that was kind of my takeaway from that. I also really quick wanted to touch on the two ideas of efforts and incentives that he talked about, and that talent is just something that people are naturally born with. I am a terrible gymnast, but my sister, and I'm terrified. I was in cheerleading and I was always on the pyramid, or whatever, and I was a flyer, but I couldn't do a back handspring to save my life. My sister, on the other hand, not a great flyer, although she tried, but she was just like the most talented gymnast, and so is my dad, that I've ever seen. She was just naturally so gifted. So this idea of, we don't want to penalize people who have talents. We don't want to tell athletes and musicians and the people like Bill Gates and those big tech execs and Google. We don't want to de-incentivize them and say, you can't be wealthy in our society and you should be penalized because you have a talent. If anything, egalitarians would argue that talent is something that we're born with, and it helps improve those that are least advantaged. They actually bring something to the table that can benefit all of us and we can all enjoy. And so that idea of incentivizing actually creates this idea that they want to share, we want them to share their talents with us. The upper class can exist if the lower classes can also benefit that in some way. I really loved the little excerpt in there that nobody is smarter than anyone else. No one is stronger than anyone else. No one is better looking than anyone else. No one has the moral right to have more money than anyone else. However, but dot, dot, dot. We want to encourage and incentivize those who do have those talents so that they can share them with everybody else. So those were a couple of my takeaways from the reading. And in the next recap video, YouTube video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about egalitarianism, Marxism, communism, and kind of how those all tie together.